My name is Evelyn Parker. I have 56 years old and I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah. For over 25 years, I was the wife of a priesthood leader in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Everyone saw him as a holy man, an example of faith and purity. When he spoke from the pulpit, people were moved. When he entered the temple, even silence seemed to bow before him. I believed this too. I believed I was married to a man chosen by God, but to man truth have a strange way of revealing what is hidden. Inside our home, far from the eyes of the church and the smiles of Sunday mornings, there lay a secret that corroded not only my marriage but also the faith that once sustained me. Today, after years of silence, I found the courage to speak, not to hurt, but to free myself and perhaps those listening to me now. Comment your city and country so I know how far my voice is reaching. Leave your like if you believe that the truth sets you free, and subscribe to hear more real stories. From the beginning of our marriage, I felt a deep pride in being the wife of such an admired man. In the community, everyone called him Brother Parker, with an almost reverential respect. People came to our home to ask for advice, blessings, and even to confess their sins. My husband was seen as an example of purity, someone who had dedicated his life to God and the church, and I believed I had been chosen by him to be by this man's side. "You are a blessed woman," the sisters in the ward would say, and I would smile humbly, not realizing that the title of blessed would soon become too heavy a burden to bear. Our life was surrounded by sacred rituals. Mornings began with family prayers, and before each meal, he would give thanks in a firm, serene voice, asking the Holy Spirit to guide our decisions. Sundays were sacred, and the home the family temple, as he often called it, was the center of our faith. I saw him preparing talks for priesthood meetings, carefully writing each word, asking for inspiration to touch the hearts of his brothers. He studied the scriptures devoutly, and when he spoke about the gospel, his voice took on an almost hypnotic power. People wept, so did I, because, for me, that man was the living reflection of faith. I believed our marriage wasn't just a human union, but a spiritual mission. I believed God had brought us together for a purpose, that the love I felt for him was part of something divine, greater than I could comprehend. When we walked side by side through the chapel courtyard, I saw admiration and respect in people's eyes. Sisters called me an example of a virtuous woman, and young couples said they wanted a home like ours. And for a long time, I wanted to believe that too. But there was something curious about the faith within our home. It was full of rules, but devoid of lightness. He didn't accept failure. He didn't tolerate weakness. Every action, every word, every thought had to be within a standard. The wife of a priesthood leader must be above reproach, he would say, and I strove to be just that. I took care of the house, the children, my appearance, and especially my silence, because I learned early on that in the life of a man of God, a wife's silence was considered a virtue. Even so, there were times when I genuinely admired him. When I saw him in his suit, with that calm expression, laying his hands on someone's head in blessing, I was moved. He seemed to have a direct connection to heaven, and I felt small in the face of it. While everyone saw him as a prophet, I saw him as the very reflection of faith. These words resonate within me to this day, because at that time, I truly believed it. I saw him as a guide, a protector, someone who would bring me closer to God. At church dinners, he was always the center of attention. Everyone wanted to sit near him, listen to his stories, his interpretations of the scriptures. He spoke about purity, about serving with a pure heart, about placing the priesthood above all else. And when he finished, people quietly applauded him, their eyes filled with respect. I watched with pride, thinking this man was truly enlightened. I didn't imagine that, behind that brilliance, there was something I hadn't yet seen, a silent shadow that grew as everyone applauded his holiness. At home, this aura of authority didn't fade. The same man who preached love and empathy from the pulpit was strict, demanding, and sometimes distant. If his children laughed too loudly, he would reprimand them, saying that reverence begins at home. If I showed sadness or weariness, he would quote a verse and remind me that the priest's wife must be strong, because the enemy attacks the homes of the chosen. And I believed him. I believed every word. For many years, my love was also my blindness. I thought obedience would bring me closer to God, that silence was synonymous with wisdom, and that submission was part of my sacred role as a wife. When other women commented on how lucky I was, I smiled, but inside, I felt something strange, as if there were an invisible distance between the man everyone admired and the husband I slept with every night. I couldn't explain it, I just felt it. There were times when he seemed to carry a burden he wouldn't share with anyone. He would spend hours locked in his office, his Bible open, his eyes staring blankly into space. When I asked him what was wrong, he would simply say, "There are things a wife doesn't need to know." These words, spoken so many times with calm and authority, were the seed of doubt that began to grow within me. At the time, I didn't know that what he called sacred was actually the beginning of something dark, and that the home I believed to be a reflection of heaven was quietly becoming a mirror of the shadows it hid. I wouldn't learn this until many years later, when the faith that bound us together began to shatter, one truth at a time. Life within the church shaped every detail of our day. Everything revolved around meetings, spiritual duties, and priesthood goals. Weeks were planned according to the ecclesiastical calendar, and Sunday wasn't just a day of worship, it was the center of our existence. I accompanied my husband to everything: stake conferences, family visits, baptisms, and silent services inside the temple. He was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. He walked in an impeccable suit, scriptures in hand, and a steady gaze, as if he carried a divine purpose no one else could comprehend. Inside the temple, he seemed like a different man, untouchable, respected, almost sacred. The way people addressed him revealed the power the title brought. President Parker, Brother Parker, Man of God. These names were spoken with reverence, almost awe, and he liked it. I saw in his expression a mixture of humility and power, as if the altar fed him with an energy that made him greater than the others. When he spoke during a meeting, the silence was absolute. Everyone seemed to be waiting for a revelation. And, in a way, he spoke as if he were actually receiving one. People trusted him more than they trusted themselves. I remember sisters coming to me with tears in their eyes, thanking me for sharing my husband with the Lord's work. I smiled, trying to appear grateful, but inside I felt a pang of discomforters. If this man I shared with the church had long since ceased to be fully mine, rituals were part of our routine, almost like breathing. On Mondays, we had family home evening, where he led us through the scriptures and gave talks on purity and obedience. On Wednesdays, there were meetings with other priesthood leaders. On Sundays, he spent almost the entire day outside preaching, counseling, mentoring young people, blessing the sick. When he returned, he was exhausted, but he didn't talk. He would simply say, "Some matters are too sacred to be discussed outside the temple." And with that, he ended any attempt at dialogue. Over time, I noticed that the temple was transforming him. It was as if, upon walking through those white doors, he ceased to be the man I knew and became something different, more distant, more rigid, colder. Within those walls, he was the admired leader. Outside them, an absent husband. The faith that strengthened him in public seemed to drain him at home. He said that spiritual work required sacrifice, and that I should understand. And I did. Or at least, I tried. There were days when I would wait for him awake, listening to the clock ticking, wondering what he was doing in so many secret meetings, closed only to leaders. When I asked, he would smile tenderly and say, "It's not a lack of trust, my dear, it's reverence. There are things only the priesthood can understand." This phrase was repeated so often that it became a kind of wall between us, an invisible barrier, separating woman from man, home from church, the human from the divine. And the higher he rose in the hierarchy, the more distant he seemed to become from what we called family. Pastoral visits increased, phone calls came at all hours, and I learned to be content with his presence at dinner and evening prayers. Sometimes, when we prayed together, I sensed a coldness in his words, a mechanical, repeated, almost rehearsed faith. It was as if he were more concerned with appearing faithful than with feeling God's presence. Despite this, in front of others, he was impeccable. He knew what to say, how to act, how to convey emotion. He was the kind of man who made people believe the church was perfect. And, in a way, he fed off that perfection. The more they praised him, the more he seemed to distance himself from reality, sinking into a role of purity that no longer corresponded to what I saw at home. It was at this time that I realized the weight of the word leader. It wasn't just a title, it was a shield. Everything he said, even the things that hurt me, was accompanied by the justification that it was divine will. I learned not to argue, not to doubt. The church taught me that the priesthood was the highest authority on earth, and that to question an anointed man was to question God himself. And so, silence grew within me, until it became part of my way of life. But there were times when things got out of hand. Sometimes, during dinner, he would suddenly stop, go silent, and stare into space, as if remembering something he couldn't say. Other times, he would arrive late, his gaze heavy, and his body tense. He would say it was sensitive, priesthood matters. I never insisted, because I'd learned there were boundaries a faithful wife shouldn't cross. And yet, deep inside me, something was beginning to stir. Subtle, almost imperceptible restlessness. I wanted to believe everything was, as he said, that the secrets were spiritual, not human. But there was one detail I couldn't ignore. Every time he mentioned the priesthood meetings, his gaze changed. It was as if a shadow crossed his face, as if he carried something that not even prayer could erase. That unshakable faith that united us began to turn into distance. He had the respect of the temple, but he had lost the warmth of home. And I, who had always seen him as a reflection of faith, began to wonder if the light everyone admired didn't actually come from a fire that burned too hot to be pure. Within the church, my husband was a light, an example of virtue, wisdom, and serenity. Everyone saw him as the ideal man, the one who spoke with a calm voice, who counseled with love, who knelt to pray with a faith that seemed unshakable. But within the home, the brightness of that light gradually faded, until only silence remained. A heavy, thick silence, full of things that could not be said. The same man who embraced the faithful in the temple barely looked me in the eye when we were alone. It was as if the priest he portrayed to the world didn't fit within the home. At first, I tried to justify it. I told myself he carried too much responsibility, that the burdens of leadership were heavy, that maybe it was just fatigue. But over time, I realized it wasn't fatigue, it was distance. A cold, calculated distance that became part of the routine. He spoke little, and when he did, it was in short, almost rehearsed sentences. You need to be more patient, pray more. Virtuous women don't complain. That was how he silenced me, using the scriptures as a shield. I learned to measure my words. Any opinion I expressed could be interpreted as spiritual rebellion. He said that a faithful wife must obey, and that questioning a man of God was the same as questioning God himself. These words echoed within me, repeated so often that they began to become a silent truth. I became the reflection of what he expected. Submissive, demure, spiritually prudent, but inside, something was beginning to die. Family prayers, which had once brought me comfort, began to sound like mechanical rituals. Steve would speak, and we all just repeated. No one dared interrupt or ask questions. When one of our children, still young, questioned a church teaching, he gave them a look of sternness that chilled the air in the room. You don't have to understand, you have to obey. In that moment, I realized that fear had entered our home disguised as reverence. The nights were long. I lay next to a man who seemed to live in another world, a world of rules, hierarchies, and secrets. Sometimes he prayed before bed, but not with me. He did it alone, silently, on his knees, for long minutes. I watched him and felt a strange sadness, as if that prayer were not a conversation with God, but a request for forgiveness for something I could not know. Over time, the home became a loveless temple. Each room had its own reverence, its own restrictions, its own forbidden words. Laughter diminished, spontaneity disappeared. Everything had to appear perfect, dignified, holy. I was the leader's wife, and that meant maintaining an appearance of purity at all times. There was no room for doubt, for tears, for weariness. If I showed weakness, he reminded me that the enemy uses emotions to weaken faith, so I learned to smile even when my heart screamed. At church gatherings, we were the exemplary couple. Everyone praised our harmony, the beauty of our family, the example of our children. I listened and simply nodded with a discreet smile, but inside, something hurt, because I knew the perfect home people saw was just the reflection, a false reflection, projected onto a wall of silence. In church, he preached about light, but inside the house, we lived in shadow. The arguments were rare but intense. There was no shouting, just sharp, cold words, spoken with a calmness that hurt more than any shout. He knew just the right tone to make me feel small, to turn any questioning I had into guilt. You're letting pride rule your heart. That's not how a godly woman speaks to her husband. These phrases became the daily sermon of my soul. I began to doubt myself. Was I being unfair? Was I just not spiritual enough to understand the burden of a man of God? The days became a silent routine. I would wake up early, make coffee, watch my children leave for school, and watch him dress in his suit with the same solemnity as always. He would leave with a Bible tucked under his arm and a distant look in his eyes, and when the door closed, the sound of the latch made me feel as if a wall had been erected between us. Sometimes I would cry silently, but soon I would remember the words he repeated. A woman of faith does not complain. She prays. Then I would pray, and the room seemed empty. As the years passed, I realized that love had turned into devotion, and devotion into blind obedience. I respected him, admired him, but I no longer loved him in the same way. The man who had won me over with sweet words and kind gestures was gone, replaced by a figure I feared offending, and yet I was still there because the church taught me that marriage was eternal, that divorce was a spiritual failure, and that enduring with faith was the greatest proof of loyalty to God. It was during this time that I began to notice something I'd never noticed before. He avoided certain names, certain topics. When his children asked about certain leaders or priesthood meetings, he'd quickly change the subject. These things are not to be discussed at home, he'd say. And I, as always, obeyed. But each time he said this, the shadow inside me grew a little deeper. Deep down, I knew. He knew something was wrong, even without proof. The spirit I had learned to recognize as comfort now warned me. And yet, I remained silent, because fear had already become our form of prayer. The fear of displeasing, the fear of questioning, the fear of seeing what was hidden behind that perfect faith. And so it was that, within a home that seemed blessed, I learned to live with absence, the absence of affection, dialogue, and truth. The church exalted him as a man of light, but I knew his light shone so brightly because it hid shadows no one dared see. It was around that time that something inside me began to shift. Small things, almost imperceptible details, began to bother me in a way I could no longer ignore. My husband had always been reserved, but now his reserve had turned into secrecy. He spent more time away, citing emergency priesthood meetings. Sometimes he would leave late at night, wearing the same dark suit he wore to church, and claiming it was for spiritual reasons. I trusted him, or at least tried to, but the feeling that something was wrong followed me like a constant shadow. One night, he got a call after 10. I was already in bed, and the sound of the phone broke the silence of the house like a scream. He answered quickly, whispering something and stepping out into the hallway. Through the crack in the door, I saw his expression change, his face tense, his voice low. his gaze fixed on the floor. I stood still, listening. Yes, I've already talked to him. But we need to protect the priesthood. No one can know about this now. Those words pierced me like a knife. Protect the priesthood. That phrase echoed in my mind. I waited for him to finish the conversation. When he returned to the room, he acted as if nothing had happened. He lay down, turned to his side, and immediately pretended to be asleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing and a strange feeling in my stomach. For the first time, I felt afraid of the man sleeping next to me. In the following days, he became even more distant. He kept his cell phone in his pocket at all times and never left it on his desk. He began locking his office door, something he had never done before. When I asked why, he said they were confidential church documents that not even I should see. I don't want you to carry the weight of sacred responsibilities, he said with an almost rehearsed calm. But I knew it wasn't about the burden. It was about secrets. One day, while tidying up my office, I found a manila envelope in the back of my drawer. Inside were notes with names and dates, and at the top, handwritten, were the words "Worthiness Report." I didn't know what it meant, but I recognized the names of some members of the congregation. When I heard the door open, I quickly put the envelope away. He came in, looked around, and, in a tone that was too controlled, asked, "Did you go through my things?" I denied it, but I saw a mixture of anger and fear in his eyes. It was the first time he had looked at me as if I were a threat. After that, the atmosphere in the house grew even more tense. I felt like I was being watched, measured, evaluated. He started calling me weak-minded, saying I was letting the enemy's influence into the home. All because I started asking questions, because I wanted to understand why the man who preached transparency was always shrouded in mystery. The nights grew long and cold. Sometimes I'd hear him talking on the phone, locked in his office. Other times, I'd just see him return late, his gaze distant, his shoulders hunched, and his hands shaking. One morning, I got up to get a drink of water and found him standing in the hallway, holding his cell phone and staring into space. When he saw me, he hid the phone behind his back and smiled tightly. "Go back to sleep, honey. It's okay." But nothing was okay. I could smell the fear in the air, the same fear that made him flee from my eyes and trapped him in a world I couldn't reach. It was then that I realized the lies weren't new. I had just learned to ignore them. I began to remember past situations that now made sense. Phone calls he claimed were from the stake presidency. Late-night visits that couldn't be discussed. Envelopes discreetly delivered during meetings. Small signs I'd ignored out of love, faith, and obedience. And now, all these signs came back to me like a puzzle finally beginning to come together. One afternoon, I went to the chapel to take a plate of food to one of the sisters in the ward. When I arrived, I saw his car parked next to the administration building. I found it strange, since there were no meetings scheduled that day. I waited for a few minutes in the car and, suddenly, I saw him get out, not alone, but accompanied by another leader. They were both speaking softly, gesturing urgently. Before getting in the car, he looked around, as if afraid he was being watched. That chilled me to the core. I'd known him for over 20 years, and I'd never seen him act like that. That night, when he returned home, I asked where he had been. He answered without hesitation, "Visiting a sick brother." I simply nodded, but inside me, the trust had been shattered, not by the lie itself, but by the calmness with which he told it. There was something about this man I no longer recognized, a gleam in his eyes that seemed to be of guilt, not faith. The following days were filled with constant tension. Every time the phone rang, my heart raced. Every time he said he had to leave, I felt a chill. He tried to keep up appearances, but there was no longer any harmony between us. The home that had once been made of prayer was now made of silence. And silence, I learned, also speaks and sometimes screams louder than any words. One night, hearing him on the phone again, I decided to approach the office door. His voice was low but firm, We need to deal with this internally. If anyone finds out, it will tarnish the name of the priesthood. It's best if we resolve this between ourselves. I clapped my hands over my mouth to contain the sound of my own sigh. Resolve it internally. Don't let anyone know. I didn't know what he was trying to hide. But in that instant, I understood something that changed everything. It was on that day that I realized that what he was hiding wasn't just about us. It was about the church. That week, the tension at home became almost unbearable. He avoided my eyes, spent hours locked in his office, and the weight of that invisible secret seemed to fill every room. His silence screamed louder than any argument. I was no longer sleeping, no longer eating properly. Something told me there was a truth there, a truth too big to ignore. And deep down, I knew, once discovered, it would change everything. It was a Sunday afternoon when it all happened. He left, saying he needed to visit a brother in need, but he'd forgotten his cell phone on the table. It wasn't common. He always carried it, as if it were part of his priestly uniform. The phone vibrated twice, with the same unidentified number. I hesitated, but something inside me, perhaps desperation, perhaps instinct, pushed me to pick up the phone. The messages were short but direct. They discussed the young man's case and the church discipline meeting. One text read, "We've already transferred the funds. The stake bishop will resolve this quietly, as agreed." My body froze. I read and reread those words, trying to understand. Funds, resolve, in silence. I knew the church had a rigid hierarchical structure, but this reeked of a cover-up. I continued scrolling with trembling hands. I found a short audio message from another leader that said, "We need to protect the priesthood. If this gets out, it will stain us all." In that moment, everything inside me collapsed. The pieces began to fall into place. The mysterious meetings, the phone conversations, the heavy gaze, the fear. It wasn't just a personal secret, it was something bigger, something institutional. I had discovered that my husband, the man I believed served God, was involved in a scheme to cover up abuse within the church. Young men had reported it to local leaders, stories hushed up in the name of priesthood worthiness, and he was one of those who kept silent. I was paralyzed. My hands trembled. My heart pounded. I read those messages like someone staring into an abyss. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was there, cold, direct, impossible to deny. The man who prayed with me every night was the same man who helped hide the suffering of innocents. Protecting the priesthood, they said, but who protected the victims? When he returned home, I looked at him differently. For the first time, I saw the weight of guilt in his eyes, and he realized I knew. He was silent for a few seconds, then sat down and murmured, "You don't understand. I did what was necessary to protect the church." His voice was low, almost a whisper. I felt a chill. He continued, "These things cannot be exposed. The world wouldn't understand. We must resolve them within the faith." "Resolve within faith," I repeated, feeling my indignation grow. "You call hiding the pain of others' faith?" He stood up, furious, and shouted for the first time in years, "You don't know what you're saying. I am a man of God." But at that moment, his words rang hollow. God wasn't there. What I saw before me was a broken man, trying to justify the unjustifiable. I lay awake all night. Every memory of us came flooding back, the smiles, the prayers, the advice, the sermons. It all seemed like a lie. How could anyone live between two such opposing truths? A man who preached purity yet simultaneously helped cover up sin. I wept until I had no more strength. Not for myself, but for the people who had been silenced. For the young people who trusted the church and found abandonment. In the days that followed, he tried to act as if nothing had happened. He repeated religious phrases, trying to convince me that this was a test of faith, that sometimes God tests leaders with moral dilemmas, but I no longer listened. The sound of those messages still echoed within me, and no justification could erase the fact that the faith I knew had been betrayed by those who were supposed to protect it. I began to understand other things. Meetings with other leaders became more frequent. There was always a tone of urgency, of fear. One day, I accidentally overheard part of a conversation on speakerphone. One of the men said, "The victim's family is threatening to go to the press. If this gets out, headquarters will take action." I almost dropped the glass. Victim thirst will take over. What else were they hiding? How many cases were there? My husband noticed my gaze and abruptly hung up the phone. "You shouldn't hear this," he said dryly. "These things don't concern you." But they did. They concerned my faith, my life, my home. And in that moment, I felt something snap inside me. That day, the man I called my husband stopped being the servant of God everyone adored, and became a stranger who lived by appearances. That phrase has stayed with me ever since. I looked at him and no longer saw the admired leader. I saw a man trapped in his own hypocrisy, a slave to an institution that preferred silence to truth. For weeks, I lived like a shadow inside my own home. I avoided contact, avoided questions. He feigned normalcy, continued preaching on Sundays, blessing families, comforting the faithful, and I, sitting in the chapel pew, watched the scene in silence, feeling a lump in my throat. The same man who said the truth will set you free was the one who feared discovery. One night, I decided to confront him again. "How many more people do you need to deceive to feel righteous?" I asked. He sighed wearily and replied, "It's not deceiving, it's protecting. If we expose everything, we destroy the faith of thousands." I looked at him intently and said, "Faith doesn't need lies to survive." He looked away, and I realized he already knew he had lost control of the church, of his family, of me. That night, I slept in the guest room for the first time. I didn't cry, I didn't pray. I just lay in silence, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of what I had discovered. And it was there, in that silence, that something inside me was freed. I understood that the love I felt for that man had died the moment I discovered what he was hiding. The faith I'd been taught in the church also died, but, curiously, my faith in God was reborn. Because in that chaos, I realized that God never asked me to be blind. He asked me to be brave. And that's how I understood the most painful truth of all. The truth I found destroyed my marriage, but saved my soul. After that discovery, the world seemed to spin. In slow motion, the house that once seemed like a spiritual refuge became a silent prison. Every step, every word, every look he gave me carried a weight I'd never felt before. I needed to speak. I needed to understand. The silence was an open wound, and fear, a constant presence within me. I spent nights rehearsing what I would say, imagining how he would react, until one day, unable to bear it any longer, I confronted him. He was sitting at his desk, reviewing church papers. When I asked, my voice trembling, "Why didn't you ever tell me what was happening? Why hide something so serious?" For a moment, he stood still. Then he looked up, cold, measured, and answered with a calmness that startled me. "You don't understand the responsibilities of a man in the priesthood." I remained silent, but he continued. "There are things common people should not know. Certain truths cannot be spoken. The priesthood demands silence." The words came out like a sentence, and in that moment I realized I wasn't standing before my husband. I was standing before the leader he had become, a man molded by hierarchy, who believed more in the institution than in God. "But what about the victims?" I asked, feeling a lump in my throat. "What about the young people who were hurt? What about the families destroyed?" He sighed impatiently. "You don't understand. If all this comes to light, the church loses its credibility. It's better to resolve it internally, to maintain its image. People's faith depends on it." Those words hit me like a punch. Keep up the image. That was it, then. Truth could be sacrificed as long as the facade remained intact. I looked at him with tears in my eyes and said, "So it's more important to appear holy than to be righteous." He looked away, and his silence was the confirmation I'd feared. In the days that followed, I tried to act as if nothing had happened, but the atmosphere at home was suffocating. He watched me suspiciously. and I felt afraid of provoking another argument, afraid of being accused of lack of faith. When I tried to talk to a close friend from the church, she quickly interrupted me. "Sister, be careful what you say. The enemy uses doubt to weaken the priesthood." I never forgot that phrase. I realized his safety net was much larger than I imagined. Little by little, loneliness set in. Within the community, I could no longer speak freely. People seemed to notice something in me, a tired look, a change in my expression, but no one asked. It was easier to pretend everything was fine. My exemplary husband continued preaching on Sundays, while I smiled mechanically in the chapel pew, stifling tears. At home, fear mixed with guilt. He told me I was being used by the adversary, that my questioning was a spiritual temptation. "You are straying from the faith," he said sternly. "God places men to guide the church. If you doubt them, you doubt God Himself." These words tore at me. I no longer knew where obedience ended and fear began. One night, while I was washing the dishes, he approached silently and placed his hand on my shoulder. The touch that had once brought me security now made me shiver. "Promise me you won't tell anyone about this," he said, his tone calm and threatening at the same time. "You know what can happen if this story gets out. The church protects its own, but it also knows how to defend itself." My blood ran cold. It wasn't just a spiritual warning, it was a warning. From that moment on, I began to live like a shadow. Every word I spoke was measured, every gesture calculated. I began to fear the sound of the telephone, unexpected visits, even the gaze of my fellow church members. Fear grew like ivy within me, covering everything that had once been faith. I tried to seek outside help, but soon realized it would be impossible. The people I trusted most in the church, wives of other leaders, longtime friends, changed their attitudes. One of them warned me, "You're putting your husband's name at risk, and the name of a man of God cannot be tarnished by a woman's emotions." That sentence was the final blow. The community that had always called me sister in Christ now saw me as a threat. My husband, noticing my isolation, reached out again. He told me he loved me, that everything he did was out of love for faith, and that one day I would understand. But the love he claimed to feel felt more like a spiritual prison. He prayed beside me, asking God to enlighten me, to take away the spirit of doubt. Meanwhile, I prayed silently, asking God simply for the courage to keep breathing. The nights became torment. I tossed and turned, trying to banish the image of the man sleeping beside me. Sometimes he would mutter snatches of prayers, as if trying to convince himself he was still a righteous man. Other times, he would wake with a start, sweating, and say he was having nightmares. I knew the weight of guilt was crushing him too, but he would never admit it. In the temple, everything remained the same. He ascended the pulpit with the same smile, preached with the same eloquence, while I watched him and wondered how many of those words he still truly believed. The community continued to applaud him, the faithful called him a chosen man, and no one imagined what really went on behind the walls of our home. Over time, I realized that it wasn't just him who was imprisoned. I was trapped too, not by physical chains, but by an invisible web of fear, guilt, and appearance. The faith that had taught me to trust now taught me to fear, and that fear had become the new God that governed my life. I no longer knew what was right or wrong. I only knew that silence was the only possible path within that community. A heavy, imposed silence, disguised as devotion. I saw the other women, always smiling, always obedient, and wondered how many of them also kept secrets they could never speak aloud. Deep down, I felt like I was on the verge of collapse, but at the same time, something was beginning to blossom within me, a seed of courage, small, silent, but alive. I didn't know it yet, but that fear that paralyzed me would one day be the same thing that would push me toward liberation. I remember the day I finally realized I could no longer remain silent. It wasn't a sudden decision, one of those made with movie-like courage. It was a slow, painful process, made up of tears, prayers, and sleepless nights. For a long time, I tried to believe that silence was protection, that if I said nothing, God would understand the weight I carried and forgive me from within. But what I discovered is that silence, when it fuels injustice, becomes sin. And I could no longer bear to sin with my mouth shut. His words, "Certain truths cannot be told," echoed in my mind like a distorted sacred echo. I had believed it so much that I almost forgot the sound of my own voice. But something inside me began to change. It was subtle at first, an uneasiness in prayer, a strange feeling during services, a weight on my chest every time he stepped to the pulpit to speak about purity and repentance, until one day, during a meeting, I saw him lay his hands on the head of a young woman in the congregation, and I noticed something in her eyes, fear, a fear I recognized. It was like a mirror showing me everything I had experienced for years. That night, when we got home, I sat alone on the couch, staring at the cross hanging on the wall. That symbol that had always signified faith now seemed like a mirror of silence. I knelt and wept. I didn't ask for strength or revenge. I asked only for discernment, and it was at that moment that I felt something different, as if God were saying to me, "I never asked you to be silent." The words didn't come audibly, but deep inside, I knew it was time to speak. The next day, I began writing. I grabbed an old notebook, sat at the kitchen table, and began to write it all down. The fear, the pain, the lies, what I had discovered, what I had felt. At first, my hand shook so much that the letters came out crooked. It was as if the very act of writing challenged the invisible chains that had bound me for years. Each line I wrote was a liberation, a wound exposed to the light after so long hidden. Then I discreetly reached out to other women in the church. I sent cautious messages, testing their trust. To my surprise, some responded with the same hesitation and the same pain. One said to me, "I thought I was the only one." Another confessed, "My husband is also a leader, and I also discovered things I can't tell." It was there that I realized my burden wasn't individual, it was collective. Hundreds of women lived under the same yoke of silence, carrying their faith like a chain rather than a liberation. We began meeting in secret, first at home, then online. At first, there were just 3 of us. Within a few months, there were 10 of us, then 20, each with their own story, but all with the same plot. Holy husbands in public, shadows in private. We spoke quietly, as if still afraid to be heard, but the simple act of speaking was the first step toward healing. I saw tears turn into strength. I saw women who couldn't look themselves in the mirror begin to rediscover their dignity. It was in this process that I realized something that changed everything. God didn't want my silence, He wanted my conscience clear. It wasn't rebellion, it was true faith. Faith in truth, faith in justice, faith in light, and the more I spoke, the more I felt He truly heard me. It was as if I'd spent years praying to a closed heaven, and only now the windows were opening. One day, I decided to make my story public. I recorded a simple video, no makeup, no scenery, just an open heart. I looked into the camera and said, "For years, I lived believing that obedience was the same as loving God. Today I understand that loving God means having the courage to not hide evil even when it dresses itself in faith." I posted the video and turned off my phone, trembling. I thought no one would see it, but within a few hours, messages began arriving from all over the country. People who had also experienced the same thing. Former members, wives, children of leaders. People who said to me, "You put into words what I lived in silence for years." Of course, the criticism also came. They called me an apostate, a traitor, a weak woman. They said I was being used by the enemy. But, curiously, for the first time in my life, these words didn't hurt. I was no longer the submissive and fearful woman who believed in spiritual threats. I was someone who had discovered that truth and faith are not enemies, they are sisters. My husband, upon discovering the video, reacted furiously. He tried to intimidate me, tried to make me delete it. He said I was tarnishing the name of the family and the church. I simply replied, It's not my silence that will cleanse the world of its filth. It was the last long conversation we'd had. He looked at me with anger, but also with something I'd never seen before, fear. Fear of the truth. In the days that followed, I realized something liberating. I no longer feared rejection by the church, because I had finally understood that God didn't live inside. He lived within me. And when I understood this, the weight of the years melted away like dust. I began helping other women tell their stories, encouraging them to break the silence. We founded a small support group, unnamed, unlabeled, but with a purpose. We prayed together, we cried together, and above all, we listened to each other, something the church never truly allowed us to do. Today, when I look back, I see how far I've come. I lost a husband, I lost friends, I lost the respect of an entire community, but I gained something no one else could take from me, the peace of a clear conscience. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that hell wasn't leaving the church. Hell was living inside it, pretending nothing was happening, pretending that love justified pain, pretending that obedience was faith, pretending that fear was devotion. Today, the sound of silence no longer frightens me. It has become my ally, because it is in this silence, the true, the free, the one that comes after truth, that I finally hear the voice of God. The decision to speak out wasn't the end of the journey, it was the beginning of something bigger. After I told my story, I noticed voices emerging from all sides. Women I'd never met, but who seemed to carry the same pain in their eyes, began reaching out to me. At first, they were short, discreet messages. I saw your video, and I experienced that too. Others said, my husband was also a leader. I was also silenced. They were different stories, but the same script, the same weight of fear, the same silence imposed by misinterpreted faith. I began to realize that what I experienced wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a system, a cycle of control and guilt sustained by years of indoctrination. And within this cycle, women learned to smile even when they were broken inside. What had previously seemed like a personal tragedy now revealed itself to be something much greater. And, paradoxically, that was what brought me solace. Knowing I wasn't alone healed a part of me I didn't even know still hurt. Over time, these women formed an invisible but powerful network. We no longer needed temples to feel close to God. He was there, in the midst of our conversations, our shared tears. We talked for hours, remembering what it meant to be heard without fear. One of them, named Grace, said something I've never forgotten. The church taught me to fear hell, but the real hell was spending my whole life pretending everything was okay. That was the moment I realized we were all being spiritually resurrected. We began meeting virtually, and then in person. Some created support groups in their cities, others began writing anonymous blogs, and some opened channels to share testimonies. It was as if each voice lit a small light band together. These lights began to illuminate a space previously dominated by the darkness of silence. Each story told became an act of faith more powerful than any sermon. I also rediscovered my faith, but in a new way. For the first time, I felt I could pray without fear, without scripts, without guilt. I discovered a God who didn't demand perfection, only truth. And it was in this truth that I began to rebuild myself. I remembered how much I had lost: a marriage, friends, community, but I realized that what I had gained was infinitely greater. I gained myself. There were times when I thought about giving up. There were still hateful messages, veiled threats, people from the church trying to silence me again. But now I was unfazed, because all around me, hundreds of women were speaking out, and none of them were willing to return to silence. It was as if each of them carried a fragment of my courage, and together, we were unbreakable. One day, at one of these gatherings, an elderly woman said something to me that became my motto: what was once shame is now my strength. That phrase struck me deeply, because it was exactly that. For a long time, I blamed myself, hid, felt impure for having doubted, for having questioned. But now I saw that there was no sin in seeking the truth. The sin was in hiding it. I began to live lightly, without masks. I no longer presented myself as the leader's wife or the faithful sister. Now I was simply a woman with a story, a real, painful, but also redemptive story. When people ask me if I still believe in God, I answer, more than ever. But now, I believe in the God of truth, not the God of fear. The women I live with today are my new congregation. Our prayers don't follow scripts. Our conversations have no hierarchy. When one of us speaks, everyone listens. When one falls, the others catch her. It's a faith made of humanity, not perfection. And it's this faith that sustains me when longing or the pain of the past try to bring me down. Sometimes I get messages from people who are still trapped within the structures I left behind. They say, "I'm afraid of losing everything." I respond calmly, "You only lose what was never truly yours." What is yours? Your dignity, your conscience, your faith. No one can take that away. Today I look back and barely recognize the woman I once was. The one who believed that love was submission, that faith was blind obedience. Now, I know that true love liberates, and genuine faith questions, illuminates, and awakens. Sometimes I walk alone through the streets of my city and smile as I remember the journey. There are still marks. Of course, wounds don't disappear overnight, but there are also scars that shine, reminding me that I survived. And, above all, that I transformed my pain into purpose. Today, every time I tell my story, it's not to reopen wounds, it's to show that there is healing beyond fear, that there is faith outside the temple, that there is life after silence. And when someone asks me what I learned from all this, I answer without hesitation, what was once a shame, today is my strength. The time has come to close this testimony, not with sadness, but with peace. For years, I believed that God expected silence, submission, and patience from us. Today, after everything I've been through, I understand that He never asked women to be silent. He asked courage to live in truth. I spent half my life believing that faith meant enduring in silence, accepting everything, and trusting that one day I would understand. But now I know that true faith is not blind. True faith sees, questions, seeks, and even when fear tries to silence it, it keeps speaking. Because faith is not born of fear, born of light. I look back and see the woman I was, silent, devout, trying to be perfect to please God and the church. But what I learned is that God does not dwell in temples of stone, nor in the rehearsed words of sermons. He lives in a clear conscience, in the courage to tell the truth, even when it is uncomfortable, and in the heart of those who choose the light, even if it means walking alone. Today, I understand that the real sin wasn't doubting it, was pretending not to see, and that true repentance isn't hiding the wounds, but exposing them so others know they can be healed too. When I decided to speak out, I lost so much: friends, family, community, but I gained something that no leader, no institution, no dogma could give me: spiritual freedom. God freed me when I decided to stop lying for Him, when I realized that divine love doesn't require fear, and that faith, to be real, must go hand in hand with truth. Today I pray differently. I no longer ask to forget what I experienced. I only ask that my voice reach someone still in the dark, believing that silence is holiness. If you hear me now, know this: God doesn't want your silence. He wants you to awaken. He wants your heart to be free, your conscience to be alive, because faith is not born of fear, it is born of light. And if my story touched you in any way, be part of this chain of truth. Comment, "I'm awake. I want to know the truth." Leave your like off. This story touched you. Subscribe to hear more real stories from people who, like me, chose truth over fear. And watch the next video. The testimony of someone who also dared to say what no one else dared to say. Today, I conclude this story with a peaceful heart, because I understood that God doesn't need to be protected by lies. He is truth itself. And every time a woman finds the courage to share what she experienced, the sky opens a little more, and the light wins again.